Alright, so I am done applying all the textures, except for like the 50 t-shirts, but that's really not necessary for this tutorial, so I'm going to do that after I'm done. But I have all the body groups on and all the um, textures needed. Uh, Looks pretty good, right? We got all the PBR textures, roughness, metalness, ambient occlusion, all that good stuff. However, if you look at his hair looks bad. It looks greasy. It looks awful. All right, and uh, I forgot to mention stuff about transparencies, but we'll do that here. So we're gonna look at the hair texture and see why it doesn't really look like hair at all. Now, normally a big mistake people make when they are trying to add hair to a character they're porting, that they try to use VR hair shader. Yeah, don't use this. Don't use this. It looks terrible. It's actually extremely bad, and even Valve doesn't use it. I don't even know why they have it. My assumption is that they were experimenting with a hair shader and realized, oh, well, we can just fit like two checkboxes into the VR Complex shader. It will basically do the same thing. So they just didn't finish it. So we're going to go back to VR Complex. Use VR Complex for hair, always. I can't think of any other reason to use it unless it's supposed to be hair that doesn't actually look like hair. So if we look at the transparency tab here, you'll see there will be two available checkboxes here, alpha test and translucent. Now, which one you pick will usually depend on whether you want your transparent object to cast shadows or not. So if you don't need it to cast shadows, you would click translucent. However, hair does actually cast shadows, so this really wouldn't work in our case. Plus it doesn't look very good to begin with anyway. So we're going to switch to alpha test. We look here. Looks a lot better. Hair looks a lot thicker. And look at that. It casts shadows. If we look at these two alpha settings, let's see. We obviously have the translucency map, right? This was provided from the game rip. We have alpha test reference and anti-alias edge strength. Now, these are the settings that it'll usually default it to. And if we preview the hair here, let's preview it this way so we can see it the best. And turn specular off so we can see this better. All right. So here's the hair. It looks pretty fine. So what alpha test reference does is it's basically what controls how much of the texture casts shadows. So if we have anti-alias strength turned all the way up, we can see exactly what parts of the hair will cast shadows. So if we turn this all the way up where it's pretty faded and not much of it's there, you see it's very thin and not like hair at all, and it's not really casting that much of a shadow. If we bring it all the way up, it's going to be at its thickest. And it's going to cast a pretty thick shadow. And, this looks kind of alright. However, if you kind of look in here, there's going to be some, looks a little too pixelated. So let's bring that down to default's usually 0.5, which works pretty well. But if you feel like a little higher number is fine, or a little lower number, I should say, like here, doesn't seem to have any bad pixelation. I would say usually thicker hair is better, unless it's the case where the characters you're using has actually very thin hair, then obviously you would make this value higher. But yeah, if this is how you want it to cast shadows, then yeah, that's fine. So what anti-alias strength does is has no control over what the shadows cast. However, it shows how like soft the transparency gets. So if we start turning this down, you can kind of see that the edges get a lot softer and it starts to look a little bit more like actual hair. So we do that. You see the hair gets a little thinner and you know, overall looks fairly realistic and still casts those nice shadows. So personally, I'm going to have my setting at 2.5 alpha test reference for the shadows and anti-aliasing strength at 0. If the developers of the game that you're porting knows what they're doing, then usually the anti-aliasing strength will be set to 0. Because the default texture will look exactly how you want it to look. All right, looks fine. And, you know, looks all right till we add specular, which is supposed to make things look good when you have like a roughness and metalness on it, which this hair does, but it doesn't look very good because it doesn't look like hair. Well, that's because it needs anisotropic gloss, which we can click this check mark here to add it. And what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to make hair look, there's this specific sheen that you'll see on hair that you won't exactly see on someone's face or their clothing. Maybe on some types of clothing, I believe it'll have a similar effect. But on hair, it'll look especially different. So our current roughness is sort of this gray, dark gray color, which is not going to look very good. We're going to reset this to default for the sake of previewing. And to change the way that the gloss looks with anisotropic gloss is based on the redness of the texture. I guess the red channel of the texture. So a good default starting setting to start at is like right about the halfway point between gray and red at the very top. And now you'll start to see it looks more like hair. It's got that, it's kind of like a line, you know? It looks pretty good, and we can fine tune that. We can make it like the line like really sharp, which is like, I suppose, if your hair was just in water, it'd look kind of like this. But his hair is not quite that moist, so we're gonna turn it down. I usually like to have mine like right about here. Maybe a bit more to the left. Yeah, and that's where I'd like it. And sometimes hair is a bit more reflective, so I'll have them, if you turn the metalness up, you'll see what I'm talking about. See, that's way too much. So if we make it, I'm going to make mine 0.25, but you can fine tune yours to see what looks the best. Sometimes that's good, sometimes 0.5 is good. I'm going to put mine at 0.25. And I'd say that looks pretty close to how I'd want it to look. And if we check back to model doc, we can see with a cube map, it looks especially nice. That's some nice hair, Travis. Now, Travis, let's see how you look without those glasses. So he looks kind of alright, but something's a bit off about his eyes. You know, they don't quite look like how eyes are supposed to look. They could look better. And they will, because we're going to turn the current shader it's using into an eyeball shader. So let's click on shaders here, change this to VR eyeball. We're going to save. Let's preview this. Well, that looks worse. Mostly because it's got this occlusion on here. Remove that. Normally you don't really need that. Let's just turn this all the way down. We can see his eyes a lot better. And see that little glint in his eye? That's kind of what we're looking for. That looks much better. Now I see that I've put G-Man in the same lighting. What it's missing is subsurface scattering. These little, highlighted red edges around the ears and nose and the thin parts of the skin that, makes a character feel less pale and vampire-like. Now, subsurface scattering isn't absolutely necessary for a character port, especially in the cases of porting, lower poly models or, I don't know, like a Half-Life 1 model is not going to need subsurface scattering for any reason. That's going to look really weird and bad. But in this case, I want to add it. It's purely because I think it looks good, and I think it would work really well on this particular character. Programs I've used or can use to generate subsurface scattering is Blender, Substance Painter, and Nald. Although I would probably go with Blender because it is the most free option. If you want to bake a subsurface scattering texture, I've got a link to a video in the description that will tell you how. Alright, so now that I have the subsurface scattering texture that I generated, we're going to go into the material editor. And right now we have the VR Complex shader. However, to have subsurface scattering, we're going to need to switch it to the VR Skin shader. Which has some changes to the way the texture reflects, and also, obviously, it's subsurface scattering. So, your settings in that you had in VR Complex overall should be thereabouts the same, except when you go to here, the normal map, you can kind of blur the normal map if you want to. Like, let's say it seems like, I don't know, too detailed. Oh, well, that's what it looks like when you don't have a subsurface scattering texture on it. Kind of crazy. For now, we're gonna just turn it off completely. You'll notice, well, it's supposed to make the roughness like smoother, if you want to do that. Now, personally, I feel like the less blurry the better in this case. And you can see, you might be able to notice that, well, the way the skin reflects actually looks a bit more like skin. You can change like how the specular, how those reflections or whatever look. See, this is probably how it would look if he got rained on or something like that, but I'm gonna leave it at default. It's usually the best. And I'd say all the other settings leave the same. Now let's add our subsurface scattering texture or mask that we made. So now we have a proper mask. So if we go here, you can already tell that the nose and the ears specifically have stronger subsurface scattering like they do in real life. Let's put it behind the ears so you can see that better. And it's pretty cool. However, it seems a bit strong. So, and also if we look here, the way it kind of, it's hard to tell at first, but the way it kind of crosses the face is usually pretty off. You could see it especially more here. Way to, like in this case, way to improve that is to check the box, use per vertex curvature. That should make the subsurface scattering curve better, but this preview is almost always really bad, so trust me when I say overall it does look better. And yep, but it is still too strong, so what we're going to do is we're going to turn up the transmission fall off. Usually 2 to 2.5. In this case, if your texture looks like this, it depends. Sometimes textures around the whole face is usually not as black. They're usually like a slightly lighter gray, and that might affect how you want your transmission fall off to be. So we'll look back here. Subsurface scattering is much weaker. Much weaker. But it's still there. To a degree that makes much more sense. And really, aside from fine-tuning of fall off or whenever you're generating your image, your subsurface scattering texture, if it hasn't been generated already, that should be it for skin. Alright, so I'm editing the video right now. The main recording was recorded a couple months ago, and there's something I learned about per vertex curvature since then to make it look better. And so if we, let me just delete this real quick for the sake of the tutorial. If we click on this cube here, the visualization mode, and select curvature, we'll see that, you know, all of like Travis's body parts except for his face has, well, it's just pitch black. There's no like lights and darks and grays and whites and whatever. It's just completely dark, and I think that's because when you check per vertex curvature on the material, it makes it so only the material controls the curvature, not the mesh as well. So to fix that, you want to right click on the head or whatever mesh has the subsurface scattering on it, and you'll want to add render mesh markup, and you want to check calculate per vertex curvature right here. Compile it. And now you'll see here that it does have lights and darks or whatever. And this curvature will basically, when it looks like this, it makes the sort of subsurface scattering a little bit like stronger where it doesn't need to be when you generate when you generate it like this. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to go into the material editor, and we're going to move this a bit and close this on the left side. And see, I have the head material pulled up here, and you can change the curvature scale right here under the color tab. And you can drag it up in case it needs to be increased. You can drag it lower if it needs to be decreased. In this case, it needs to be decreased. So you'll basically want to decrease it until the only things that are like really glowing are the thin parts on the face. So that's stuff like the lips, the nose, and the ears. So normally what I do is that I like put it on 2.5 and that does that pretty well. And if you need to turn it lower, you can. But you'll want to at least the ears and the nose to be pretty lit up around these specific areas. So I have it on 2.5 on most of my ports. It's just like a pretty safe number to put it at. Um, so if we go to, it's a bit harder to see in Model Doc, but in SFM you'll definitely know the difference. So that's how you do that. And that's the end of this advanced materials tutorial.